This Week in Explore is our second week looking at Genesis, and today we're going to look at chapter 2. Now, chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis are the second story of creation. In some Bibles, like the Lutheran Study Bible that I have here, you'll even see a header in the middle of verse 4 of chapter 2 that says another account of creation. Now, it's easy to miss this unless you pay really close attention. But even without looking at all the Hebrew words and the stuff that scholars say, it's pretty clear when you take a close look at what we see in Genesis that chapter 2, starting in verse 4, it's not part 2 to the creation story. This is a separate account of how the world was created, and it's different than chapter 1. Now, since this is so easy to miss, a lot of people, I find, are surprised to hear that there are two different creation stories right at the beginning of the Bible, right next to one another, and things are created in a different order, seemingly for different reasons. So if you try to read Genesis from a strictly literal, scientific textbook kind of way, you're going to run into problems. And on the literal level, things contradict one another, even at the very beginning. Now, as Pastor Doug talked about last week, I'm not bothered when things don't match up on a literal level. And I don't think you should be either, because they're not all meant to be taken literally. The beginning of Genesis is more like poetry, and it shows us deeper truths about God and the universe. It's just not a literal story. Peter Innes wrote this really interesting article that made me rethink about how I talk about contradictions in the Bible, though. So he says that as long as we don't try to make the Bible into something it's not, like inerrant or always literal, then it actually doesn't have to contradict itself. See, and he compares this to oatmeal. I know this is going to sound random, but stay with me. I promise it connects. If I say, I love oatmeal, and then I turn to someone else and say, I hate oatmeal, that's a contradiction. I'm contradicting myself. But if 20 years ago I used to say, I hate oatmeal, which is probably what I sounded like in this picture when I was 12 or 13, but now I say, you know what? I've come around. I love oatmeal. That's not a contradiction. My views have just changed over time. Or if I say, I love oatmeal, but my son says, I hate oatmeal, which he does, by the way, that's not a contradiction. Those are two different people voicing two different opinions. And often, it's these last two examples. That's what we see happening in the Bible. Either our views about God and the world change over time, and that's what we see reflected, or there are different traditions that reflect different points of view. And it's this latter idea, which is what we see in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Two distinct takes on how God created the world, and they just show us different things, different insights about ourselves and about God and the world around us. So the first story of creation is very orderly, it's very systematic. It's divided into 7 days, and in each one of these days, something different is created. And you have light and day, you have the sky, land and vegetation. Day 4, there's the lights in the sky, the stars, the sun, the moon. Day 5 is birds and sea creatures. Day 6 is when you get land creatures, animals, and then finally humans at the end. And then on day 7, God rests. So the beginning of chapter 2 is the end of that first story. Let's look at that. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the 7th day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So this first story, like I said, is very systematic, very orderly, but the second one is much more personal. You see God walking around and talking with people, interacting with them. It shows us a different side of God. So this is right where we left off, the second half of verse 4. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. So no plants or vegetation yet in this one. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So in this story, God made the heavens and the earth, but no life yet. And then, the first example of life, God takes the earth, the dirt, and forms the first human being, this first person, and breathes life, the breath of life, making that human being come alive. So the first story, remember, people were at the end. We were the finishing touch, created after everything else on day 6. But in the second story, the person is created first. And then after that, you'll see if you look at the rest of chapter 2, God then plants a garden. Then God makes plants and trees. And then after that, God makes animals. And then there's this whole episode of creating a woman and a man. Now, this is what I want to spend a lot of time on today because I find this really interesting. So this is how most people understand the creation of human beings in the second creation story. Remember, if you look at chapter 1, God creates humankind and specifically says men and women were created at the same time, both equally made in the image of God. But chapter 2, things appear to be different. God makes man first, whose name is Adam. We all know that, right? And then, verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." So then, if you know this story, God creates the animals to see if any of them will work as a partner, but it turns out they don't. But at least this man, Adam, gets to name all those animals. And then verse 20, "But for the man there was not found a helper as his partner." So then God uses divine anesthesia, puts Adam to sleep, takes out a rib, and makes out of that rib a woman whose name is Eve. So, how most people see this, God creates a man first who needs a partner, and then God creates a woman to serve that partner and make the men complete. That is how most people, or at least a lot of people, read this story. But actually, when you look at the Hebrew, it tells us a different story than that. It just gets lost in translation. So let's start with the word that's translated here as man in the NRSV. There are some translations, like the King James, that sometimes this same word is man, and in other verses it's the word Adam, right? The proper name for this man. But the Hebrew word is ha-adam, so that's where we get Adam. It literally means an earth creature or a dirt creature. It's actually just a play on the Hebrew word for dirt or earth. See, in Hebrew it reads, "Out of the ha-adamah, the dirt, came the ha-adam, the dirt creature." In other words, it's not a word to specify a male, as in a man versus a woman. There is a Hebrew word from that. It's the word ish, and ha-adam is not that. It's not used here. And actually, the same word, ha-adam, is used in the first story of creation. Look at Genesis 1, verse 17. "So God created ha-adam, humankind, in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." So clearly, ha-adam here is not just men. It says God created ha-adam, both male and female. But the same word in chapter 2 is translated as man. "Then the Lord God formed the man, the ha-adam, out of the ha-adamah, the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." So what you see as man in most of chapter 2 is still this Hebrew word for earth creature that's not yet defined as male or female. And then watch what happens in verses 22 and 23. "And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man," ha-adam here, "he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken.' Now, this last man, if you look there, I put in a different color because it's a different Hebrew word than all those other men above it. It's the word ish. And unlike ha'adam, it specifically means a person who's male. Now, the word for woman is the word isha. So out of ish comes isha. So we started with this earth creature that didn't yet have a defined sex, and then God divides it up and creates two new beings, the Ish and the Isha, the man and the woman, who are created at the same time to be partners and to help one another. Now, I'm sure that you can see how this story throughout history has been used to support sexism and patriarchy, especially when you look at those problematic translations that make people think that the first woman was created after the man in an effort to serve the man's needs. But we've just seen that's not actually what the text says. Really? This story is about our innate need for relationships and community. So God creates this earth creature that doesn't have a defined sex. Well, why? Because there's only one of them. You don't need the sex organs yet. Now, again, this isn't meant to be understood literally, so turn off your evolution, biology, scientific lens for a minute. Here's the point that I take away from this story. Human beings were created, and even in a beautiful world, a paradise of landscape and plants and animals, life was missing something important. So look back at verse 18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the ha'adam, the human beings, should be alone." I think this goes beyond just intimate, sexual, or married relationships. We are social beings. We are meant to live in some form of community. It's not good for us to be alone. That's built into the fabric of creation here. And then in that same verse, verse 18, God says God will make a helper as a partner. Now again, this verse has caused a lot of problems, especially when we think this is talking about women serving men, which we've just seen it's not. But even when we take out that context of sexism, does helper mean that some people exist for the sole purpose of serving or being slaves to others? A lot of people throughout history, including a lot of Christians, think that that's how God set up the world. There's a hierarchy. Some people are at the top and some people are at the bottom, and that's the way it's meant to be. But let's look at that word helper. It's the Hebrew word ezer, and look at some other places where this word is used. Psalm 30. "Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper." So who's the helper here? God. Psalm 54. "But surely God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life." Psalm 121. "I lift my eyes to the hills, from where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." It's about 90% of the time that this word ezer, helper, is used in the Bible. It's used to describe God. Clearly, God is not subservient to us. God is not lesser or inferior to us. So we are not meant to look down on other people. We are not meant to act as if some people exist for the sole purpose of serving us. God made us to be partners, and to be partners with God, and to be partners with one another, to help one another to work together and live in this world. Now, there is obviously a lot more to this story. The forbidden fruit, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the snake leaving the garden, but I don't want to make this into an hour-long thing. I think we have enough to chew on for now. So if you want to join the conversation Thursday, or if you just want to dig a little deeper in this on your own, I invite you to read through chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis and take a closer look than you normally would. Try and keep your eye out for some of those places where people have used things to support sexism and patriarchy and slavery and other hierarchies. And then when we get past those negative interpretations, what are some of the helpful things? that you think this text might show us today? How can this help us understand our relationship with God and with the world around us? And if you haven't ever put in much thought about these two different accounts of creation, well, look back at chapter 1 again, looking for the details. Notice how chapter 1 is different from chapter 2, and ask yourself, why would these editors of the Bible leave in both stories? How can one story of creation show us some things that the other story doesn't? So I hope this has been a helpful time for you, and any of you who can join us on Thursday at noon, I hope to see you then.